Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Bullish on Business, where we really dig deep into bold ideas and global strategies, shaping the future of entrepreneurship, innovation, and wealth creation. And specifically, in today's podcast, we're going to be discussing the EB-5 visa and how that really plays out in times like these. Well, today I'm thrilled to introduce our guests. It's Jason Auerbach. Hi, Jason.
Hi, Rose. Pleasure to be here. Thank you. So excited to be a part of this podcast.
Oh, I'm so happy you're here. And he is the managing director of Navis Wealth Advisors. Let me say that properly. Navis Wealth Advisors, like navigate.
Yes.
Jason brings so much background. It's a powerhouse. He's held senior roles at the acclaimed Deutsche Bank, Merrill Lynch, Wells Fargo, and other leading institutions. Now at Navis, he's building a boutique client-first model that especially is relevant to the EB-5 investors and international families, navigating cross-border opportunities. And I love the client-first concept. We first connected, he and I, at the EB-5 conference in Miami, where Jason stood out to me as a thought leader, truly, with his vast experience in this whole realm of finance and banking, and then bringing it down to the clients and then the families. It really touches my heart. He's a thought leader and now a wealth advisor, intersecting immigration investments, which is very important, but very nerve-wracking, I'm sure, and all that compliance and with investment strategies. His insights on balancing residency goals, which is so critical, and then wealth management, navigating complex across borders and unlocking growth opportunities over here in the States for entrepreneurs, for communities in the United States, and for those global families. And we are so happy and incredibly excited to have this valuable conversation for you, our audience today. Jason, welcome again to the show, and we're glad to have you on Bullish on Business.
Rose, I couldn't be more excited to be here and to share and to help out within the EB-5 community. Truly a very exciting opportunity to be here.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to jump right into it. And with no further ado, we first connected at the EB-5 conference in Miami, and that was before this kind of pseudo gold card or whatever we're calling it today. What really stood out to you in the conversations there, and why was it important for you to be there? What was critical for you to go to Miami in August? I know you're up there in New York, where that's probably the most beautiful time of the year in Rye, New York, isn't it?
Well, it's beautiful in Westchester, New York. Our headquartered in Rybrook, which is at the southern part of Westchester County in New York.
Beautiful.
And truly, it is beautiful unless you're a Giants and a Jets fan. The reason we attended the conference down in Miami was to meet centers of influence who are critical to the EB-5 process and introducing potential investors to the EB-5 process and helping them as they get to the United States. The role of Navis is to help them navigate, no pun intended, but is to help them navigate the complex financial world that we call the United States and the United States tax system. So one of the goals that we were down in Miami was to meet immigration attorneys, like yourself, influencers like yourself, regional centers, and really explain that when people get to the United States, it's so much more that they don't know. And that's where Navis can really step in. It's understanding what are the implications to the income that you have both in the United States and overseas. What happens to your assets overseas, and is there tax implications, and how are you going to hold your assets in the United States? Are you married? Do you have children? What are the implications financially to you if you come to the United States as any kind of visa holder? But more importantly, what happens when you get your EB-5 visa your temporary green card, and eventually your green card. And so we will help people navigate that very complex world, because there are so many things that people don't know, Rose. It truly is amazing. I'm happy to get into some of those details.
Well, what I think that is ever present on my mind is what are their first questions? What are they curious about when they first approach you, or does it vary?
So, so it does vary, but I will tell you a strong majority of people, the first question they have is what are the implications to me from a tax perspective when I get to the United States? So it's important to know that if you derive any income overseas, whether it's wage income, self-employment income, or let's say you have real estate income because you own rental properties overseas, it is absolutely required that all of this information be reported to the United States taxing authorities. And if you are a resident alien in the United States, meaning you have a temporary green card or a green card, or you become a US citizen, your overseas income, all of your worldwide income, is subject to US taxation. So when people come to the United States, it's very important that they understand what are the impacts to how they make money overseas and in the United States. The second question that really comes up are, what are the things, I hate to say this, what are the things I don't know? And that's a very large area of knowledge. For example, what I just talked about is how do you set up your assets in the United States? If you buy a home, do you want to buy that in your own name, or do you want to buy that and put it into a trust? So if you're married, yep. So if you're married and something were to happen to one of the spouses, that piece of real estate, unlike a US citizen, does not pass tax-free to your spouse or to your children. It would be subject to both federal and state estate taxes. Now, there are steps that anybody who comes to the United States can take in order to protect those and make you feel like you're more like a US citizen. For example, you could set up what's called a qualified domestic trust. You could put a residence in there, and then if something were to happen to one spouse, it would pass without subject to estate taxation to another spouse. So financial planning and tax planning are really the top two questions that we receive and that we help clients navigate when they get to the US.
Well, that sounds like a very, very complicated journey. It sounds as though could be fluid, and depending upon how they proceed is going to make probably pretty big impact on their financial future.
So
And
you,
what are
you
we
brought up
talking about in percentages, like making a wrong move? Let's say they go, they should have gone right and they went left. Are we talking significant percentages of income tax?
You are talking about a tremendous implications to not making the right decisions. I'll give you two real examples that have affected the EB-5 community. So as many people may be aware, you can do what are called concurrent filing. So if you're in the United States on an F1 visa because you're a student and you decide to make an EB-5 investment, well, most students aren't deriving income in the United States, so they file what would be called a 1040EZ form. There's no income, there's no liabilities, it's just a reporting mechanism once you're a resident alien in the United States. But here's what's very important. If you make an investment with a regional center, you are going to be issued something called a K-1. This is a document that represents how much ownership you have in a property and how much income is your responsibility to report, or also how much liability do you have to report. So we are working with a current client who came to the United States in 2019, was issued K-1s beginning in 2019 with their regional center, but they did not report any of the K-1 liabilities on their tax returns. So now if they receive interest income or dividend income with the return of their asset from the regional center, which will happen in 2026, there are no losses that the applicant can take and put onto his tax form because they were not reported in previous years. You cannot file your tax returns in 2025 and say, I want to take losses in 19, 20, 21, 22, and 23, unless you had reported losses on previous tax returns. So that's a real example of an applicant who was unaware of how to properly file tax returns.
Great example. What a case study.
Another example is we had a gentleman who invested in a large mutual fund in Eastern Asia. Now, there's something called a passive foreign investment corporation. What the US government is making sure is that you're not making investments overseas and not paying the proper amount of taxes on them. In fact, there was a famous Supreme Court case about a year ago that addresses some of these issues. So if you have a pooled asset overseas that is not being reported to the United States, and that is a normal thing that happens. You could have a mutual fund in Italy that tracks the S&P 500, a United States stock place. And if you are not having your income reported to the United States, then they're going to assume that it is a much higher income that you are receiving, and therefore the penalties can be extremely excessive on your overseas assets, even if you did not receive any distribution of income from those overseas assets. So making sure that you understand what is in your international portfolio and how it is to be properly reported to US authorities is extremely important. And I just want to finish by saying you can have those pooled assets overseas. It's just that there's a proper way to report it. And most people don't do that because they're unaware. So those are two real world examples of significant monetary damages that could happen to somebody because they don't know how to properly account for things in their tax planning.
Well, and I appreciate that an F1 student really, how would, I mean, the experience and the savvy to really understand what you just described is really
a student wouldn't have to file tax returns because
right.
they have no income, and that's not a permanent resident alien visa. However, if you don't file the tax returns, you cannot count the K-1 liabilities, which will come into play later on down the road.
Well, thank you for all describing what those cases and how there is a huge need for some guidance. And will you explain to me the difference between a wealth advisor and your CPA, or really what is the difference and what is your role in this world of
So wealth advisor can have a lot of different connotations, and there's a lot of things under its roof. So let's break it down. So one of the things you want to do is look at tax planning. Tax planning would be one of the things that you can do under wealth advisory. Tax planning means understanding what is your overseas and your domestic income. How is it supposed to be properly reported? And you're going to report different investments differently. So for example, if you have investments in the stock market, you could have what are called unrealized gains. You don't pay taxes on those, but the value of your stock could go up in a domestic transaction. You need to understand, how do you want to account for that? So there's tax planning that goes into it. Now, if you owned real estate, you can have two different types of real estate investments. You could either be a professional real estate investor, meaning that your losses can be claimed every year as active losses on your tax returns, or you could be a passive real estate investor. And what that means is any costs that go into your real estate are, quote, suspended, meaning that when you sell the property down the road, you can then take advantage of those expenses when you sell the property. So you bought a property for $100, you sell it for $150. You'd normally pay taxes on the $50 that you made. However, with a suspended loss, if you spend $1 on redoing the roof, $1 putting in a new refrigerator, those losses can then be taken off the gain. An active loss would be if I make $100 in 2025 and I have $2 of losses in my real estate, I can take those $2 of losses and apply them to my current year tax returns. So that would be tax planning. Financial planning would be, how much money do I want to set aside for a child for college? I'm thinking about buying a house in 2 years. I want to make sure that I'm able to retire when I'm 65 years old.
Mhm.
What are the things that I need to be doing with my investments to achieve those different goals? So tax planning would be talking about what are the tax implications of what you do. Financial planning is what are the steps I want to take. And then there's wealth advisory / money management. So when people move their assets to the United States, you don't necessarily always want to put it just into a checking account or a savings account. You may want to make investments. Those investments could be in equities like stocks, it could be in bonds or fixed income. And how do you want to balance your portfolio? And that really is going to depend on what stage of life are you at? Are you old or are you young? Do you have children or not children? Do you have to pay for college? Are you looking to buy a house? So the investments that we would make for a client really depend on their goals and what they're looking to do. And every client is different. And that's why it's important with whomever someone works with when they come to the United States, it's important that they understand what their goals are and understanding how their immigration status is an important part of that discussion. And that's whoever you work with, that's an extremely important part of the process when you get to the United States. And that's why we like to say to people, find yourself a financial chief of staff, someone who
Oh,
can help you with every step along that. It's
right.
such an important piece of the puzzle.
That is, and I had no idea that, it does tax planning, financial planning, investment strategies. Wow, that's a lot to think about. Even me as a podcast host, it seems super overwhelming, and you need somebody who
But it
you,
doesn't have to be, Rose. That
yeah.
when you have the right partners, it can seem overwhelming. Like anything you do in life, if you're not familiar with how to do it, it could quickly consume everything that you're
Well,
doing,
the thing
which is
that
why
I love
having
about you is that you break it down, which I love. You make it seem so commonsensical, whether that's the examples that you just projected. They were great examples, and you weave it together so that it makes so much sense. So I think that the next thing I'm curious about is with the residency goal and the whole wealth management goal, do they ever conflict?
the residency goal and the wealth management goal, do they ever conflict?
Like, is there ever an issue about, well, this is the type of visa I want to do, but this is,
Yes. So you
so
have
I'm
to
just,
really understand based upon your visa status, what are the different implications? And it really comes down to are you what's called a non-resident alien, which you have very, very little reporting requirements, versus a resident alien. So that would be a temporary green card, or even these long-term visas. Certain visas will have tax implications where you'd have to pay taxes on your global income. So the first thing that we do with any client is we want to sit down, understand their visa status, and
right.
understand what are the implications to you, and then walking them through step by step. One of the first things that we do is we love to work with folks prior to them coming to the United States. So when you file your 596 form, that's really the first time you would want to engage a professionally in the United States to understand what are the implications based upon what's going on in my life around the world when I move to the United States. And that's where, whether it's Navis or another partner that you're working with, is you very methodically, step by step, go through what are the businesses I own, what are the investments that I've made. Another great example, Rose, that we've come across a number of times is that when people move to the United States, they have old estate documents in their home country. So they may have been young when they were living overseas and wrote a will and say, in case of anything that happens to me, if it was going to go to my sister, my brother, and my parents. They get to the United States 10 years later, they're married, they have children, they have a will in the United States. Something happens to them, and all of a sudden you've got assets overseas, you've got assets in the United States, and now you've got these two conflicting documents.
Oh dear.
So it's very important that we make sure that documents overseas are doing the same thing as they are in the United States. I'll give you another great example. We have a client who lived in England for 50 years, emigrated to the United States, and was filing their taxes with one of these large, everybody uses them, tax providers. They were receiving about £15,000 a year as pension income from the country of Great Britain. The first certain amount of pounds, I think it's 20 or 25,000 pounds, are not taxable in England. So when they filed their US tax returns, they failed to report their pension earnings from the United Kingdom on their US tax returns. When we met them, we showed them that this was actually an extremely important piece of the puzzle. It had to have been reported. There were tax obligations in the United States. And again, it was just a matter of not knowing. When you are an immigrant from overseas, it is absolutely essential that whoever your partner is, doesn't have to be us, but whoever your partner is, has an expertise in understanding international income, international assets, and the implication when you move to the United States. It truly is amazing to me how many people don't realize the implications of that. Another example we had probably in the last 6 months, we were going through something with a gentleman and we thought we had everything buttoned up, and an unexplained amount of money came into one of his accounts. I said, "Oh, that's rental income." We go, "Rental income from what?" "Oh, I own 5 homes overseas." We're like, "But you didn't tell anybody about it." Because, "Well, it's really my mother who runs it and she manages it. There's not a lot." That doesn't matter. You still have a reporting requirement in the United States. And if you don't want those things to be reported or they can be reported and you don't want there to be tax implications to you, then you need to take proactive steps to make sure that you're as tax efficient as possible with your overseas investments.
Wow.
So working with a professional partner is essential to anything you do. You can't just show up here
Right.
and
So
go to
how do they find you? How does, I know you have a website, I've been on it, and I know that you're very, but as a typical immigration person that's looking to move into the States, do you have a referral network, or how
we work with a
do you
lot
find
of
people?
immigration attorneys, like the immigration firm that you are associated with on this
Well, to be
podcast.
honest with you, Jason, I have already thought of 3 people I want you to talk to.
Ah!
Because I just really am excited about what you're teaching me today.
And I want to be very clear. The needs of a student who's getting an EB-5 visa are going to be very different than the needs of a young family with children that's emigrating to the United States. So again, it's not a one size that fits all for everybody, Rose. The most important step that we do is we have multiple conversations with immigrants before they come to the US and when they get here and after they're here, to make sure that we completely understand. And these are not 15-minute conversations where it's really getting to know your client and digging into the weeds and really becoming, like I said, a part of their financial plan. I use the term financial chief of staff. And I think it's such an important role when you get to the United States. Now, again, if you're a student who's coming to the United States, these, again, can be relatively easy filings if you have an EB-5 application going forward and you have an investment with a regional center. We work relatively inexpensively with students to make sure, hey, is your paperwork being filed the proper way? You don't necessarily have to spend thousands of dollars to submit a 1040 EZ form with a K1 liability on there. However, most people don't know to do that. So again, that's going to be a different engagement than a family with, I'm going to buy 2 homes, one for my kids, one for my wife. Now we got to set up a trust. Oh, I own a business overseas, so we need to understand how do we account for that and make sure that it's properly reported within the United States. That's going to be a very different engagement than, I said, like a student who has no income in the United States. And then we've got everything in between. So it's not.
Well, while I was out on your website, I noticed, I went and looked at your team. Oh my gosh, I was so impressed with your team. And do you have certain people that are sort of specialists in different
So
categories?
absolutely. So my partner, Paul Fagan, who, if you go on the website, you can see him. He was formerly a senior executive at another shared family office, and he ran the international desk for them. And he was traveling to Europe and to South America constantly. So he has almost 30 years of international tax planning and financial planning um, experience. I got into this space in 2013. Was when I was fully, I guess I was exposed to it in 2011, fully came into the space in 2013, and came into it on the credit side, understanding if you're a foreign national who wants to buy property in the United States, they're understanding that there are only a handful of banks that will work with you. Again, another piece of the puzzle. So Paul, again, that's my experience. Paul has almost 30 years. Mitzi Joni, who is from Uruguay, again, has this international understanding of clients. We have people on staff that speak Spanish, we speak Chinese, we have obviously English speaking. So we try to be available to whatever the needs of the client are and make sure that we can accomplish them. But like I said, just
Okay.
on the EB5 team, we have over 100 years of international financial planning
Oh,
experience.
wow, that's amazing. And know that if you ever need any help with Japanese, both Caitlin and Ipe speak fluent.
And that, by the way, we don't speak Japanese, so I may take you up on that, Rose.
It's a little different. There's not a lot out there. So many of our listeners are entrepreneurs exploring the EB5. What should they look out for when choosing? Now we're kind of switching gears.
Yep.
They get to pick a project. I know there's a lot of projects out there that they could choose. And how should they align it with their long-term financial planning?
So there's the EB5 investment, which is there are a couple of things that you want to look at. You want to look at the experience of the regional center, and what is their track record. It's such an important piece of it. Not every regional center has had every project be successful, right? And that's, there's this belief that every project is going to be. It is really making sure that the people that you're investing with have that experience and that track record when you make an investment. And that is something that we advise all of our clients to do a real deep dive on and we work with the immigration attorneys, and we work, again, with the clients directly to make sure that they understand what project they're investing in. Also understanding from the EB5 perspective, as you know, it's not just your investment and having the money at risk that's important, but it's about creating jobs in the United States. And you want to make sure that you work with a project that is going to create the requisite amount of jobs. Because we've seen people who have tried to make a regional center, they try to build something from a real estate perspective, they get all this EB5 money and they haven't created enough jobs. And therefore, they haven't met the requirements of the program. So it's really important that you understand where you make your investment. Once you make your investment, then it's really a matter of, do you want the location to be somewhere near where you're thinking about moving? Or, are you looking for something a little bit more bespoke? Are you looking for an investment that has a certain amount of returns? And when you go to a regional center, you'll see that different regional centers will offer different amounts of return. The most important thing that the EB5 visa application is going to do is it's going to give you access to a green card.
Right.
However, whoever you invest with, whatever regional center, and we certainly have regional centers that we are highly fond of, and then there are regional centers that we've been exposed to that, again, have different track record that we want to make sure that our clients are aware of. But understand, what is your return? What is the most important thing to you? For example, return of capital, in our opinion, is the most important thing. You make an investment, you want to make sure that you're going to get your money back. And when you get your money back, you want to make sure that you're going to get that temporary green card as part of the process. So understanding who your partner is, identifying them, and making sure that whoever you're working with within the regional center is someone who's responsive to your question and can get you the information you need. For example, like a K-1, if there's a liability you need to report on your tax return. So knowing who your partner is such an important thing. And that's a very collaborative process.
Right.
It's not something that is done on one's own.
Well, I have a couple questions about
Yep.
that. So I've been told that majority of the EB5, and this is just hearsay, so you can correct me because it could be totally wrong. Is so if I invest 800,000 or a million, 50,000, what am I expecting? I've heard that it's just expect 1 or 2%.
I've seen double that
Wow.
returns. You know, there are regional centers here that I've seen in the 4%, 5% range. So you generally don't see the 11, but again, you're getting a trade-off in that because you're not going to get a same return as you would with maybe a different US based investor, because when you're doing a regional center, there are a lot of costs that go into supporting the EB5 process. And that is, again, choosing the right regional center partner is so essential to whatever it is that you do, because they've got to make sure that the project creates the jobs, make sure that it does the proper accounting, make sure that it's talking to USCIS to make sure that the proper reporting functions are going on. The last thing that you want is to expose yourself with an $800,000 investment or $1,050,000 investment, which we see less and less of. But when you make that investment, right, making sure that it meets all of the requirements so that you can still get your temporary green card. Because again, you're going to invest this amount of money. Yes, you want to make a return on your investment because everybody does, but getting that temporary green card and eventually the residency in the United States is an absolute imperative of this process. So really understanding who your partners are and their track record and their experience. So we like to work with regional centers that have issued thousands of temporary green cards.
Right.
We generally not look for the regional center that this is their first project.
Sure. You know, I had a EB5AN on a couple of weeks ago, and
fabulous group, really tremendous. Sam's a great guy. Jordan over there is a great. You've got a great team over there with EB5AN.
I really enjoyed speaking. He taught me a lot too. You guys are amazing, so friendly. Here's a crazy question. What if you get a wealth client, or I shouldn't call them that, I'm sure they're an immigrant client that comes in and they say, hey, I'm an entrepreneur. I want to do it on my own without a regional center. Have you ever had anyone approach you like that?
We've had that question asked. And we have always pointed them back to the regional centers because there's a lot of paper. So when Navis first entered into this space several years ago, we worked very closely with several different law firms to make sure that we understood what is involved in forming a regional center, what are the obligations of a regional center, and what are the ongoing concerns of a regional center. Anybody can really start a regional center for just a couple of $100,000, but that if you do it on your own, do you really want to make those legal steps in order to do it? Just in order to obtain a green card, you'll find that starting your own, making your own investment like that is not it's not an economically sound investment. So the regional centers really have perfected working with the different government agencies, filling out the different forms. And if you've ever filled out a government form, you understand if you don't do 16A-C paragraph 7 the right way, the entire form can be thrown out.
Oh, I know, it could be so tedious.
So again, I would argue that the person who comes to me and says, hey, I want to do this on my own without a regional center, I would say, if you have no accounting experience and you own several different companies, do you want to go file your own, start your own accounting firm and represent to different businesses? Hey, this is what, when you don't have that experience. Yes, you can file your own tax returns, Rose, and there are a lot of people who should and they can. And there are other situations where you shouldn't file your own tax returns. So I would say the EB5 program, regional centers, is the same thing. I
follow you there, and that sounds like very sound advice. So there's a lot changing in the immigration world these days, to say the least. And you've been in it. I had no idea that you have been in it since 2013. Gosh, that's 12 years and going on 13 years. Thank you for that depth of knowledge in helping us all figure this out. What's changing, and what do you see on the horizon?
So I've learned, especially in this environment, not to make predictions about what is going to happen. What I can tell you is that right now we are acting as if nothing has changed. So we're going to keep with the status quo. Even if the program changes, what you're going to see, or you might see different monetary obligations. You may see different time periods at which the money has to be at risk. And then there are discussions about making just straight investments to get your green card. That doesn't mean that there aren't rules that you don't understand when you get to the United States. Again, if you are a resident alien in the US, you do not have the same rights as an American citizen. And I don't mean that from a political perspective. What I'm saying is, what I'm talking about is, if you are married and one of you passes away, you do not get to pass along your assets to your spouse without an estate tax. That doesn't matter if you're an EB-5 visa, an F1, L1, or a V1, right? There are many different visas in this country, but understanding when you get to the US what your reporting requirements are. And importantly, are you considered a resident alien or a non-resident alien? So as the program changes, we'll be able to tack like a sailboat. We'll be able to change pretty easily and amend it. But the obligations of folks when they get to the United States and the implications to themselves and their families, we don't anticipate that having dramatic changes.
Mm-hmm.
But do understand, for example, that if you are a resident alien, that may have impact on your international banking. We had a client recently from the Far East who received a call from where his assets were at a major money center bank in the Far East. And they told him, oh, you're becoming a resident alien in the US. We do not bank American citizens or resident aliens of the US because of the reporting requirements back to the US. So there are a number of banks internationally that could require the moving of assets around because of the reporting requirements to the United States. And we see that with folks.
Keep track of all of that.
Well, that's why we have a whole staff, and we've got 3 CPAs on
you
our
got all these countries,
constantly,
and then you've got all these banks.
Like, you need to understand what we have treaties with some countries and we don't have treaties with others. How are you going to treat, for example, income? If you're someone coming from India, is going to be treated differently than if you come from Mexico, than if you come from Taiwan. So these are all, every country is very different. You have to know the rules.
Since the H-1B visa was slapped with that $100,000 one-time charge, have you received a lot more inquiries?
We have not been receiving a lot of inquiries around the H-1B visa fee. The last that we had heard was this did not apply to people already here.
Okay.
But there is certainly a lot of confusion around it. So I'm gonna hold my tongue until I do a little bit more digging.
That's fair enough. That's fair. So what's on the horizon for Navis, and where are you navigating next? What's going
we are excited. The next step is we're very excited to start some overseas trips in 2026, where we can meet with folks prior to them coming to the United States. We are certainly available to folks overseas. We in fact, we encourage people overseas to give us a call and say, hey, I'm thinking about getting a visa. So a lot of immigration attorneys will call us and say, my client's thinking about getting the EB-5 visa. Can you talk to them about the implications? And that's where we start. We have the conversations about, what do your overseas assets look like? What do your overseas income look like? And how is that going to impact your decision to come to the United States? So again, every situation is different, but the where I see us going is much more involvement sooner in the process.
I see.
We have clients who have called us when they've had their EB-5 visa for a year, and we've had people call us 2 years before they plan on coming to the United States. And like with everything else, we get everything in between as well. So we're looking just to grow the platform.
So I think that I would love to just ask you, do you have anything that we haven't touched on that you think is really critical to let our folks know, and what should they be looking out for?
I think number one thing is to recognize the I don't know, but I don't know. That is such an important piece of this puzzle when people are coming. So if I could give one piece of advice to people who are watching this podcast and listening to you, Rose, and listening to your daughter and that whole immigration crew, is get as much knowledge as you can up front, because it is so much easier to do things right the first time than to have to go back and clean it up. Cleaning things up is very, very expensive. Again, going back to an example at the very beginning of our discussion, where we had a gentleman here as a student was receiving K-1s with liabilities from his EB-5 investment and was not reporting them on their tax returns. Well, we now need to go back and amend those tax returns. Whenever you amend a tax return, that tax return is going to end up not being read by a computer, but it's going to be read by a human being. And that human being is going to start to ask questions.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It doesn't mean it's something you should be scared about, but it just means if you do it right the first time, there's a lot less cost, and there's not going to be questions about why didn't you do this correctly the first time. So again, just finding the right professional is such an important piece.
So I follow you there so much. Kind of keep it from the very beginning. Tax planning, investment planning, visa planning,
Financial planning, estate planning, estate planning.
All of that.
God, for goodness sakes, if something were to happen to an EB-5 visa holder when they get to the US, and all of a sudden their children and their spouse could be subject to taxation that they had no clue about.
Mm-hmm.
And they won't know how to navigate that without a professional.
We need to keep our eyes open, and it's not always, it's not the first of mind. They may be excited about, where they may live. They're excited about so many other things, but it's so critical to really engage with you and your team, Wealth Advisors, to protect what they have and what they will experience. And so I am so happy you were here today, and thank you for the great advice. I will ask you if in 12 to 18 months things are going to modify, change. Is there a chance I can invite you back on the podcast and give us an update?
I would love to come back again, Rose. I love to see you again. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Awesome. Well, good. And what we're going to do, everyone, is we're going to make sure that we put Navis's, let's get that in the show notes. You'll be able to reach Jason at his website. I will put the details about the podcast there, so you'll be able to reach out to him and his team when you are considering moving into the United States, or if you are an immigration attorney and you want someone to, be there for your client in a more of a wealth advisor perspective. You'll be able to find Jason's details and his firm in our show notes. And with that, we are going to say goodbye and see you next time on Bullish on Business. Let's say goodbye.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.